Let's begin by defining movies data source class within this data package. We can create new Kotlin class movies data source, and we can take database as a constructor to this class. Within this class, let's create a table for movies. So for that we can make use of object. We can say movies. We can extend to int id table, and within this table let's add column for title. Val title equals varchar. We can give column name as title, and we can specify the maximum length as 100. We can have column for genre equals varchar. We can give column name as genre and max length as 100. We can have description column as val description equals text. Since we are not sure about the length, so we can use text for that. We can have column for duration in minute as integer. We can specify column name as duration in minute, and let's add one array column as well. Val tags equals array. We can specify column name as tags, and we can specify the column type. So column type equals varchar column type, and we can specify maximum length as 70. So these are all the columns that we are gonna have in this movies table. Now in the init, let's create the table. So for that we can use schema utils create function and pass the table object. Now we can wrap this within transaction. So we can call this transaction function, pass the database instance, and within this lambda we can move this create function. Now let's define a function to insert a movie row within this movies table. So for that we can simply say function insert, and we can take movie as a parameter. So let's create a data class representing all the columns within this movies table. So we can have data class movie, and movie will be having title of type string, will have genre of type string, description of type string, will have duration of type integer, and tags of type list of string. Also let's have optional id as well. So we can say val id integer, and it will be optional, so we can have a default value as null. And in insert function we can get this movie object. Now to insert this movie in our table, we can have a transaction pass in the database instance, and within this we can call movies.insert to insert a movie in our movies table. We can insert title as it title equals movie.title, it description equals movie.description, it genre equals movie.genre, it duration in minutes equals movie.duration, and finally we can specify the tags. It tags equals movie.tags. Now let's get this movie as a request data. So for that we can move to the routing file and let's get rid of this get request and let's create a route with path movies. Now all the movies related path will be within this route. So let's create a post request and we can get movie as a request data. So we can say val movie equals call.receive and we can specify the type as movie and make sure to make this movie serializable. Now we can call insert function for our movie data source. So let's get object for movies data source as a parameter. So we can get movies data source as a parameter and now we can simply call the insert function and pass the movie. And finally we can respond with http status code OK. Now within our application module function we can create a object for movies data source. So we can say movies data source equals movies data source and we can pass the database instance as database factory dot database and finally pass this movies data source to configure routing function. Now we can simply run our application. Now we can make post request to /movies path. I have an object for this movie. So I have specified title, genre, description, duration and tags. You can also choose raw, then type will be JSON and define a JSON object for movie and we can simply make the request. So here you can see that we are getting 450 unsupported media type. So this is caused due to serialization issue. So let's check again. So we have annotated movie as a serializable. So now let's check the serialization.kt file. Okay, over here while generating Ktor project, it might be overridden. So first need to install the content negotiation plugin. So we can say install content negotiation and finally invoke the JSON function. We can get rid of this routing. Now if we rerun our application again and make the request, now you can see we get 200. So if we check our admin dashboard, here you can see our row. So we are able to insert a row. Now since we are using int id table, we can even make use of insert and get id function so that we will be getting the id for the row after the insertion. So for that we can simply copy this insert function and we can rename function as insert and get id and we can simply return the integer value which will be the id of the inserted row. Instead of insert, we can make use of insert and get id function. So when we use this insert and get id function, we can refer to this value for the generated id and we can simply return. Now in the routing file, let's create one more route. Let's say post. We can specify path as insert and get id. Within this, we can get the movie as call.receive and we can specify type as movie. We can call the movies data source dot insert and get id to insert the movie and get the id. So we can say val id equals movies data source dot insert and get id. And finally, let's respond with this id. So call.respond, the inserted row id is and we can specify the id. Now let's rerun our application Now we can get to the path insert and get id. To this path we can insert this movie data, and you can see that the inserted row id is 2. Since earlier we inserted one movie already, so for this next one the id is 2. So you can use this insert and get id function on table that extends to id table. Using this insert and get id, you can basically get the id of inserted row. In some cases, you might try to insert the row with existing id. So if you try to use this any of this function to insert a row with existing id, then you will be getting the runtime exception. So in order to ignore the existing id, we can make use of insertIgnore. So let's create a function insertIgnore. We can get movie data, and we will be having same logic for insertion. Instead of insert, we will be using insertIgnore. So let's update the id parameter as well. So if our request data has id and it's not equal to null, in that case we can even specify the id in our movies table. So we can get the id as movie.id. In case if our data contain the id, then we will basically try to add that id. Now in our routing file, let's copy this one and let's rename it to insertIgnore. We can get movie data in same way, and we can make use of insertIgnore function. We can pass the movie and we can simply respond with http status OK. Now let's rerun our application and let's try to specify id as well. Let's try to set the id 2. So we already know that 2 is already present in our database. Now let's update the path insertIgnore. And if we make the request, you can see that we are not getting any exception, as well as no new row is inserted. There are only the 2 rows that we inserted earlier. Since we are trying to insert the row with id 2, which is already present in our table, so it will basically be ignored. So in case there is chance of duplicate id, we can make use of insertIgnore function. Now we can also insertIgnore and getId as well. So let's copy this function and let's rename the function as insertIgnore and getId. Over here we can simply say insertIgnore and getId, and as a return type we can use integer, and we can have a return over here, and we can refer to the id as value. So instead of int, let's have nullable, since it might be possible that this insertion may fail and the inserted id will be null. So this inserted id can be nullable. Now within the routing file, let's copy this one and paste it over here, and we can rename path as insertIgnore and getId. And over here as well we can use insertIgnore and getId. Now let's rerun our application and insertIgnore and getId. Now since 2 is already present, we should be getting ID as null. So let's make the request, and as you can see, for ID 2 we are getting null since this insertion will be ignored. If we specify ID 3, then you can see our insertion is success. Now even if we don't specify the ID, next one will be 4. So you can see that we are getting the inserted row ID is 4. Now let's suppose we want to insert list of movies at once. So for that we can use batch insertion. So let's define a function batch insert, and we can pass the list of movies. Within this function, let's invoke the transaction. We can pass the database instance. Now for batch insertion, we can make use of batch insert function. And we can specify data as movies. Over here, we will be getting each movie. Now we can refer to this and set title equals movie.title. Similarly, we can set other columns as well. Now within the root project, I have this dummy data directory, and within this I have the movies.json file. So this contains around 40 movies data. So you can download this file from the GitHub repository. I'll be linking in the video's description. Now within the routing file, let's create a new path. Let's name it as batch insert. Now let's get the path for the movies.json file. So we can say val path equals dummy data slash movies.json. So make sure the path matches. Now we can convert this JSON array to a JSON string. So let's say JSON string equals file. We can use this file class and specify the path and simply call the readText function. Now we can convert this to movies list. Val movie of type list of movie equals JSON dot decode from string, and we can pass the JSON string. And finally, we can insert using bulk insert function. We can simply pass this movies list and we can respond with OK status. Now let's rerun our application again, and we can change path to bulk insert. We don't need to specify any data, so I'll select none and make the request. So currently it's a 4 not found. So let's check the path. So we have batch insert instead of bulk insert. So we can specify path as batch insert. Now let's make the request again, and it says HTTP OK. Now let's refresh the admin dashboard, and as you can see, all the data from our JSON file has been inserted. So this way we can even insert the list of data. For the further optimization of this batch insertion, we can head over to the database factory and we can add a query parameter. So we can simply say rewrite batched inserts equals true. So by default this flag is false, but we can set it to true using this query parameter in our JDBC URL. This JDBC flag tells the Postgres driver to convert multiple inserts into single SQL statement. So this flag basically improves the performance of insertion. So these are the functions that we can make use to perform the insertion in Postgres using Exposed. So that should be it for this video. Thanks for watching and happy coding.